Viktor Frankl once said, "A human being can find meaning even in suffering." And this painting, I call it Life Beneath the Sea, because there are moments in life when we don't find meaning above the surface. We only find it when we've finally reached the bottom. Because sometimes, before we find meaning, we need the courage to stay in the darkness a little longer. Frankl called this the first real test. The moment when life asks you, are you still willing to live, even when you don't have an answer yet? And if you're in that stage right now, if everything inside you still feels very dark, trust me, you haven't taken the wrong path. You've only just begun going down. And when the water finally starts to move, the story truly begins. Because life can never stay perfectly balanced. It moves in cycles. There are moments when we rise high, and there are seasons when we sink deep. If you are at the bottom right now, or even if you're standing at the peak and feel fortunate, remember this: fluctuation is the rule. It's part of the path. And the greatest paradox of being human is this: only when we touch the darkest depths do we truly see the brilliance of the light and understand the real value of the summit. Wherever you are, wherever you stand on this moving path, the wisdom forged in the depths is meant for you. I begin by covering the entire canvas with a deep blue. Using a large brush, I move in long, steady strokes. No details, no hesitation. At this stage, I'm not trying to make it look beautiful. I'm only trying to feel the depth. That feeling you get when you're falling and you don't know where the bottom is. Frankl once lived in a concentration camp. Every morning he woke up not knowing if he would survive the day. He wrote that in places like that, people lose hope for the future. And when there is no future, meaning disappears. Just like this moment. You look at this deep blue layer and you don't see anything yet. And that is completely normal. But what if this isn't the bottom yet? Frankl once wrote that, in the concentration camp, there were days when he no longer had the strength to think about the future. So he asked himself a simpler question: what is the right thing to do in the next hour? Sometimes the answer was very small. Stand up. Line up. Survive one more day. And it was this narrowing of meaning that kept him alive. He later wrote, "A human being is not destroyed by suffering, but by suffering without meaning." And sometimes, meaning doesn't come from understanding why we are in pain. It comes from choosing our attitude while we are in pain. We don't need to escape the bottom to have value. We only need not to lose ourselves while we are there. And once the foundation of the bottom is formed, the painting is no longer empty. But life has not appeared yet. It always comes last. I begin adding the large coral formations. They grow upward, directly from the rocks, not by accident. In real life, coral can only survive when there is a solid foundation beneath it. Frankl said that suffering, by itself, has no meaning, but the way we respond to suffering does. When we stop asking, "How do I make the pain go away?" and begin asking, "What will I do with this pain?" meaning appears. Not bright, but real. And yet, life doesn't stop there. Frankl once told a story about a fellow prisoner who shared his very last piece of bread with him. Not because he had extra, but because he wanted to prove something. That even in the darkest place, a human being still has the freedom to choose how to live. For Frankl, this was clear evidence that human dignity can never be completely taken away. He later wrote, "When a person knows why they live, they can endure almost any how." And sometimes, that why is not a grand purpose. Sometimes it's something very personal, very small, something only you understand. By now, the painting is no longer silent. It has a rhythm. It has movement. The first signs of life have appeared. It doesn't promise that everything will be okay. It only whispers something honest. You are not as alone as you think. And still, I know something is missing. This painting needs a stronger movement, a clearer rhythm, a form of life that can pull our eyes farther away from the bottom. And that's when faster, stronger creatures begin to appear. I start adding color. Orange, pink, purple. Not too detailed, just enough to feel that life is breathing. Frankl called this level responsibility. Not responsibility to society, but responsibility to the meaning of your own life. When you know what you're living for, you begin to live differently. There's less panic, less running away. Like coral, they don't move, but they create an entire world around them. And then, life begins to move. In his book, Frankl wrote about prisoners who survived only because they were holding on to something fragile. A familiar face, an unfinished task, or something they believed still needed to be done. These thoughts were small, but they were enough to keep them from letting go. As I paint the vegetation, I let the brushstrokes overlap. Some areas grow dense, others almost disappear. I don't correct too much, because once you start correcting, movement is lost. And when movement is lost, life disappears with it. In painting, just like in life, not everything that looks cleaner is actually better. Something interesting happens here. The deeper I paint into the bottom, the lighter it begins to feel. Not because the situation has changed, but because I've adapted to it. Frankl called this the human capacity for adaptation. When we cannot change our circumstances, we are forced to change ourselves. He wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." And it is this quiet inner change that allows human beings to endure. By now, the ocean floor is no longer empty. It has its own rhythm, its own currents, an ecosystem quietly sustaining itself. No noise, no display, just continuing to live. But the painting has not yet reached its climax. There is still a stronger movement waiting above, a moment where light, speed, and meaning will finally meet. And that is when the freest creatures of the ocean begin to appear. Have you ever tried to erase a mistake from your past, only to realize it's actually been holding up your present? As these coral layers grow thicker, I have to stop obsessing over the perfection of each individual color. Orange doesn't need to defeat purple. Green doesn't need to overpower red. The instinct is always the same. Cover the old layers, hide them completely. But if I do that, the coral loses its depth. Life works the same way. If you try to whitewash your history, there's nothing left to support who you are today. So I lay down transparent strokes, then bolder ones. No domination, just coexistence. Viktor Frankl once said, "Our value isn't measured by how brightly we shine, but by whether we are fulfilling our own unique assignment." Just like this reef, beauty doesn't come from competition, but from everything finding its rightful place. The painting is warming now, not just in color, but in feeling. It's becoming a place of nurturing, a place where life doesn't have to fight just to exist. Sometimes you don't need to move forward. You only need to stabilize, to let conflicting emotions exist side by side without destroying each other. And as these corals are finished, I realize the seabed was never the end. It became a foundation, solid ground, waiting for greater movements to rise above. I lay down layers so thin, they're almost invisible to the eye. But without them, this entire reef would feel flat, disconnected. Life is the same way. The things that truly hold us together are often the smallest, quietest things. I return to colors I've already used, placing them in new spaces. Not to reinvent them, but to let them meet again. It's like us. After being swept away by the current, we don't become someone new. We find our way back to ourselves. Viktor Frankl once observed that the survivors were not always the strongest. They were the ones who held on to tiny habits, straightening their clothes each morning, washing their face, keeping a small ritual alive, just to remind themselves, I am still human. Painting this coral is exactly that, a rhythm of small, steady actions. I'm not trying to make the painting explode with energy. I'm simply keeping it from falling apart. And perhaps, in some seasons of life, that is enough. Once the foundation settled, the first guests arrived. 3 clownfish, small, vibrant, and strangely carefree. I painted them tucked deep inside the reef. They don't try to dominate the space. They don't compete. They simply belong. Why paint them with such innocent strokes? Because we often believe that to survive in the deep, we have to become hard, sharp, unbreakable. But not these fish. They're fragile. They're slow. They survive not through strength, but through connection. They know how to find a sanctuary. The light now is no longer faint. It pours down, touching everything. But remember this, light doesn't create life. It only allows us to see what has always been there. Just like meaning. It doesn't come from above. It comes from the journey you've already walked. Individual dolphins begin to appear. Not aggressive, not hunting. They move alongside the smaller fish. Frankl was very clear about this. What helped him survive was not strength, but love. He imagined the face of the woman he loved. And in that moment, he understood something profound. A human being can live on the memory of someone they love. At the deepest level, meaning always takes the shape of connection. And when we finally realize that, we begin to rise. Now, take a moment to look at the entire painting. Life beneath the sea. Not a miracle, not a fairy tale, but a quiet truth. Meaning isn't found at the surface. It isn't found where breathing is easy. It's found in the deepest place. The place where you didn't give up. And if today you're still there, trust me, you are not late. You are simply at the right depth to finally begin seeing life